Hello, everyone, and welcome to our symposium, Behavioral Interventions to Support Employment Transition Services for Autistic Transition Age Youth. I'm Matthew Smith, and I'm chairing this session. And I'm an associate professor of social work at the University of Michigan, and I'm the director of the Level Up Employment Skills Simulation Lab. And I'm primarily interested in developing and evaluating technology-based interventions to enhance access to employment for marginalized communities, including adults with serious mental illness, transition age autistic youth and their non-autistic peers with other disabilities, and individuals completing their prison sentences and preparing to return to their communities, known as returning citizens. My research is funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Institute of Justice, the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, and the Kessler Foundation. Our first presenter today will be Dr. Kari Sung, who is an associate professor and the program director of rehabilitation counseling master's program at the Michigan State University. She is also a co-director of the Spartan Project Research and MSU Doctorate Hegarty Fellows postdoctoral program. Her research interests focus on developing and implementing community-based interventions in improving school-to-work transition, psychosocial and vocational outcomes of individuals with neurodevelopmental disabilities, including autism. Dr. Sung has published over 70 referee journal articles and book chapters and is also a Mary Switzer Fellow awarded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Following Dr. Sung, I'll be presenting, and then following me, Kari Sherwood will be presenting. Kari has a master's degree in special education, a master's degree in social work, and has a limited license to practice social work. She is a joint PhD student in social work and developmental psychology at the University of Michigan. She also has over 10 years of experience as an instructional designer. And Kari is interested in developing, evaluating, and implementing technology-based interventions for individuals with autism and other developmental and psychiatric disabilities to improve employment outcomes, including employer-targeted interventions to reduce unconscious bias in the workplace. And then following Kari, our discussant today will be Dr. Lauren Bishop from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's an assistant professor there and a principal investigator at the Weissman Center and the Institute for Research on Poverty. Her National Institutes of Health funded research focuses on empowering autistic adults to live long, healthy, and self-determined lives in their communities. She is currently studying disparities in health and well-being in autistic adults as they age. Her social work practice experience includes roles as a school counselor and a social skills group leader for children, adolescents, and adults on the autism spectrum. So thank you for joining us here today. Hi, everybody. Welcome to virtual interview training for transition age autistic youth receiving pre-employment transition services. Just a couple of disclosures before we get started. This study was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, as well as I'm a scientific partner with Submersion LLC and the University of Michigan School of Social Work, and I will receive very small royalties from Submersion on the sales of this tool. As Dr. Sung mentioned, job interviewing is a critical barrier to employment for transition age autistic youth. And in order to help fill that gap, my team and I worked with the autism community to adapt the original virtual job interview training tool to meet the needs of transition age youth with autism, and then conducted an initial effectiveness, feasibility, and implementation trial with 5 schools and 71 autistic transition age youth. And from here, I'd just like to briefly introduce you to Mr. Travis Bishop, one of our virtual hiring managers that you can access through the interventions website. And here on in the interface, you can see Travis in the top left corner, and in his window, the bottom right corner, is Kendra, your real-time job coach, and she gives you nonverbal cues as to whether what you're saying is helpful or hurtful to your rapport with the interviewer. And then when Travis asks you a question, the interface on the right provides you with a menu of options that you can read and then repeat to Travis. The tool was designed at a 4th grade reading level and meets the international highest standard for accessibility for individuals with disabilities. As a trainee, you were able to practice interviewing with either Travis or our second interviewer, Ms. Rita Munoz, where we scaffolded 10 job interview skills across 3 levels of difficulty: easy, medium, and hard. Where at easy, you have 4 job interview skills. At medium, that goes up to 7, and at hard, that goes up to 10. And then trainees receive 4 levels of feedback, including nonverbal real-time cues, specific feedback on your statements, high-level feedback on your ability to perform the 10 job interview skills, and a numerical score from 0 to 100. Overall, the tool was designed to provide the repetitive practice and feedback that is needed to sharpen your interviewing skills. In addition, Travis and Rita have a matrix of difficulty by personality type that provides them with 9 different personalities to try to capture variation in the types of hiring managers that you might encounter out in the community. In terms of the trial, it was a randomized controlled trial at a 2-to-1 randomization where the participants who actively worked with Rita and Travis, there was 48 in that group and 23 in the control group who received pre-employment transition services as usual. And then our Rita and Travis users also received pre-ETs. And what we see here in this table is just that, by and large, the 2 groups did not differ with respect to demographics and the severity of autism. In this slide, we see that, again, the 2 groups didn't have any significant differences in terms of their cognitive ability and employment history, as well as their projected job search. So just wanted to share that again, these 2 groups are pretty similar. Now, overall, the results of the study, first, we just wanted to talk about the adherence. So overall, on average, the participants working with Rita and Travis completed 15 virtual job interviews that ranged from 10 minutes on easy to 15 minutes on medium to about 20 or 25 minutes on hard. 61% of the participants completed 100% of the recommended curriculum, which was 5 interviews each on easy, medium, and hard. 17% of the sample completed all easy and medium interviews and completed 3 to 4 hard interviews. And the remaining 22% of the sample completed all easy and medium interviews and anywhere from 0 to 2 hard interviews. In terms of the primary outcomes, first we measured whether working with Rita and Travis compared to pre-ETs as usual influenced job interview skills that were assessed using a mock interview at pre-test and post-test, and then research staff that were blind to group assignment rated the performances. And what we see here is a significant interaction statistically in terms of the pre-ETs group working with Rita and Travis improved their job interview skills total score over time, where the pre-ETs only group did not improve and declined a little bit. That total score represents all 10 of the job interview skills targeted by the Rita and Travis intervention. Our second outcome here is likeliness to be hired. Prior to providing scores on the individual job interview skills, the raters gave a rating from a 1 to 5 scale on the overall likeliness that they would hire the individual in the interview. So it's sort of a global rating capturing things beyond just the 10 specified job interview skills. And again, we see a significant interaction where the Rita and Travis group improved significantly compared to the pre-ETs only group. And then in terms of the job interview anxiety, our third outcome here, we see that the participants interviewing with Rita and Travis significantly decrease their self-report of feeling anxious about job interviewing compared to the pre-ETs as usual group who did not have changes in their anxiety over time. Next, we're targeting our employment outcomes, where We observed that 0% of the pre-ETS only group obtained competitive jobs compared to 26% in the pre-ETS plus Reed and Travis. Competitive jobs are reflected as jobs out in the community that are not set aside for individuals with disabilities, and that you had to go on site and get a job or complete a job interview to get those jobs. And then in the next bullet, we see that 30% of pre-ETS only obtained non-competitive jobs within 6 months compared to 15% in the pre-ETS plus Reed and Travis group. And the non-competitive jobs reflect jobs where the students were initially completing an internship or a volunteer position at a business, and then they carried that position forward into a paid job. And so they were already primed for being employed in that setting. But when you combine competitive and non-competitive employment together, we still see that the pre-ETS plus Reed and Travis group had a higher rate of employment within 6 months. And then when we look at that in a statistical model, a logistic regression, we do see that the group status does hold up. In this figure, we see a translation of practicing with Reed and Travis to increasing one's role play performance at post-test. In turn, that is related to obtaining a competitive job within 6 months. So even though it's not a pure mediation analysis, it's just giving us some initial idea of, are these variables related? And indeed they are. But we did not see a direct relationship between performance scores with Reed and Travis and competitive employment rates. So it does appear to be an indirect effect through actual interview skills. On this slide, we report on the student acceptability of Reed and Travis. The scale that we used was self-report with a total possible score of 25, and the mean was 20. And here are some of the quotes from the students. You can read them. I'll just read one of them. You know, my favorite thing was getting a good idea of what was proper to say during an interview. And so, you know, these quotes just reflect that we're seeing that the students found the tool to be highly acceptable. Now, Kari Sherwood will dive deeper into teacher level acceptability and implementation outcomes in the next presentation, but I do want to share some initial insights that teachers shared with us, such as the tool also gave you know, the students a little bit of that natural anxiety that we all get when we go into an interview. You know, what is the right answer to this? Another quote reflects, real life situation was not something we've been able to get him to do, but he was able to interact with Rita and Travis and has learned a lot from that. And then lastly, I really thought it'd be a great opportunity for my students. Like I said, I'm a career readiness class. My job as a teacher of, you know, students with special needs is to get them jobs, and anything I can do to make them successful is exactly what I should do. So I jumped with it head on and I enjoyed it. In terms of some discussion points we wanted to highlight were that, you know, VITTAY or the Reed and Travis tool demonstrated initial effectiveness at improving interview skills, reducing anxiety, and elevating competitive employment. Preliminary evidence suggests that the tool improves employment outcomes by enhancing interview skill. And we found that the tool is highly acceptable by students and teachers. In terms of our future directions, to conduct a fully powered randomized controlled trial to validate the tool's effectiveness among autistic youth receiving special education pre-employment transition services, as well as validate this tool's effectiveness among non-autistic youth receiving special education pre-employment transition services. And we're already developing a new virtual tool to enhance work-based social skills for transition age youth with autism, where we're trying to use the same technological interface to create a virtual workday where youth can practice being more effective talking with customers, coworkers, and supervisors. So with that said, I just wanted to thank you for your attention and make sure to acknowledge our university partners as well as our school partners, that we could not have done this study without them. And then I just wanted to, you know, again, thank you for your attention, and we'll move on to questions, or if you have additional questions or would like a demonstration, feel free to reach out to me. Here's my email address and our lab address. So thank you for your time.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Kari Sherwood, and I am currently a student in the joint PhD program in social work and developmental psychology at the University of Michigan. I currently work with Dr. Matthew Smith in the Level Up Lab at the School of Social Work. And I am happy to be here today to present our findings from our mixed methods implementation evaluation of virtual interview training for transition age autistic youth in pre-employment transition services. This preliminary implementation evaluation of VIT-TE in schools was a pilot aim of the parent RCT that you heard about previously in the symposium. Evaluating effectiveness often takes priority, while implementation outcomes such as acceptability and sustainability are lower priority. However, evaluating implementation during an effectiveness trial can shorten the amount of time needed for translation to the field. And schools provide a critical setting for evidence-based interventions due to the likelihood that most children receive needed services within schools. In addition, very few studies have evaluated the implementation of job interviewing practices within pre-employment transition services. So we trained teachers to deliver virtual interview training for transition age youth, or VIT-TE, within 5 pre-employment transition service programs across 5 schools. And this was the study you heard presented on previously. However, for the implementation outcomes, we used mixed methods to evaluate leader and teacher perceptions of VIT-TE and student perceptions of VIT-TE. And here you can see our mixed methods design diagram. We collected data pre and post implementation, analyzed quantitative and qualitative data separately, then integrated and interpreted the data together. We used a combination of pre-implementation surveys and post-implementation surveys and interviews to evaluate teacher perceptions of orientation, acceptability, and fidelity, pre-implementation appropriateness of VIT-TE, and expected feasibility of VIT-TE. We also measured implementation context, or how the intervention was delivered, and acceptability and sustainability of VIT-TE. We also evaluated student perceptions of acceptability and usability. Here you can see our demographics of our leaders and teachers. Age mean was 49 and a half years old, and 11.1% were male. Pre-implementation quantitative survey data revealed leaders and teachers found our training orientation to be acceptable. They also implemented the training to students with 100% fidelity. Leaders and teachers also found VIT-TE to be appropriate for pre-employment transition services, and they expected implementation of VIT-TE to be feasible. Post-implementation survey data revealed leaders and teachers found VIT-TE to be highly acceptable. They were very motivated to continue to deliver VIT-TE, felt their school was equipped to support delivery of VIT-TE, and that implementing VIT-TE would be a little disruptive to their daily work routine. Autistic students reported via quantitative surveys that VIT-TE was acceptable and usable. Students found the job coach's real-time feedback to be very helpful. They used the token economy somewhat, and when they did use the token economy, they found it to be somewhat acceptable. We used thematic network analysis to evaluate the qualitative responses from the semi-structured interview survey. And here you can see our thematic network that we came up with after looking at the data. This is teacher data only. So you can see one global theme of usability, and then 3 organizing themes of barriers, engagement with VIT-TE, and real-world scenarios. And then there are additional basic themes branched off from there. For the student data, Our thematic network showed one global theme of favorite things about Vitae, which then branches off into 3 organizing themes of interview preparation, ease and enjoyment in usability, and interacting with interviewers. And then interview preparation theme is then broken down further into 2 basic themes of interview knowledge and interview skills. Mixed methods integration was then performed to make comparisons between quantitative and qualitative results. Our quantitative findings were confirmed with our thematic network analysis of qualitative interview data from leaders and teachers. So if you remember, the leaders and teachers found the training orientation to be acceptable. And you can see the quantitative results here in the box plot. And then it's also paired with a quote from the semi-structured interviews with leaders and teachers. And they said there weren't too many barriers. You guys pretty much covered everything in the training and it was pretty smooth. Getting to learn the software, of course, I could have taken more time to or been given more time to study it, but that's something that was on me. And the time constraints I had to learn the software. So maybe if I would have taken a little bit more time to kind of play with it and investigate it myself, that would help me. You might also remember that leaders and teachers found Vitae to be appropriate for pre-eds. And here you can see the quantitative results from that survey, along with a quote from a leader or teacher that says, I think the interview will give them a better sense of the process of this is what I have to do first before I can even get to the interview. And I have to make sure my application looks correct in order to get the interview. You might also remember that leaders and teachers expected the implementation of Vitae to be feasible. And you can see the results from the quantitative survey on the left, paired with a quote on the right that says, our kids have their classes that they go to, but a good chunk of the morning or even the afternoon is what's called IEP time. So it's simply independent work. You work on your IEP goals. And we have a good number of students in those classrooms who are sort of on graduation IEPs, where they're done with their credits and they're looking for kind of ways to fill the time. I think it would be a great thing to have them continue to fill that space and just continue to practice. And then as far as the integration of teacher results from the post-implementation surveys and semi-structured interviews, all teachers reported implementing Vitae at school during regular class time, and all students used their own computing device. You might remember from earlier that leaders and teachers found Vitae to be highly acceptable, and you can see those quantitative results here on the left, paired with a quote from a leader or teacher that says, I think it's a great tool. It's appropriate age level. It's something a teacher would, I think, I could not see why they would not be happy with it at all. It's very age appropriate. It's very real. You might also remember that teachers were very motivated to continue to deliver Vitae after the study. They felt their school was equipped to support delivery of Vitae. And they also, in their surveys, they also reported that implementing Vitae would be a little disruptive to their daily work routine. And you can see those quantitative survey results on the left here, paired with a quote that says, until the students met their kind of goal for a number of interviews, it was sort of time consuming, but not terribly so. That would be the only thing, that it takes a bit of time. But other than that, I personally don't have any major criticisms of the program itself. Our quantitative data from students was also confirmed via our thematic network analysis of open-ended survey data from students. Students reported learning new interview skills and finding Vitae to be fun and easy to use. And you can see their acceptability survey results here, paired with a quote that says, interactive, cool to see what the interviewer is thinking. It's different. And for the usability of Vitae, one student said it was easy to use. Overall, this initial implementation evaluation is informative for a larger scale study of VIT in schools. And as schools operate with limited funding and resources, dissemination of evidence-based interventions with adequate implementation evaluations is particularly difficult and requires diligence and access to the education pipeline. We are especially passionate about how this intervention and implementation strategy could translate into education and autism policy in the future by increasing the number of interventions available to pre-employment transition service programs for transition age youth with autism. This issue is especially salient with virtual education taking place around the US during a pandemic, and this study could address the use of accessible virtual evidence-based interventions for this population. Thank you so much for being here today. And I also want to thank all of my colleagues and co-authors, and also our school partners and participants and funders. Thank you, everyone.
Hi there, I'm Lauren Bishop, and I'm going to be your discussant for this session on behavioral interventions to support employment transition services for autistic transition age youth. So you've seen three really wonderful presentations that represent interventions at different stages of intervention development that all focus on helping autistic transition age youth to obtain employment and become ready for employment. So in Connie's presentation, you saw the feasibility and preliminary efficacy of her employment readiness intervention. In Matt Smith's presentation, you saw the study that's looking at the efficacy of the virtual interview training program for transition age youth. And then in Kari's study, you saw a mixed methods implementation evaluation. So looking more at the implementation side of implementing this efficacy trial in school-based virtual interview training for transition age youth. I want to orient us to some big picture ideas that I want to talk about in a little bit more detail today. So, interventions are developed in stages. We've established a stage model and a typical stage progression of developing interventions that applies to most intervention studies. And there are some tweaks that are made, but in general, interventions follow a stage-based model of intervention development. However, even though we have these models that are valid and seem to work in scientific settings, we need to make sure that stakeholders at multiple levels, so autistic people, the family members of autistic people, service providers, educators, policymakers, et cetera, are included throughout the intervention development process. So we should be including stakeholders to make sure that these interventions are valid and that they focus on endpoints that matter and that they work in the real world. And then finally, I think that we need to really think hard about how whiteness and neurotypicality pervade autism intervention, development, and implementation research, and what the impact of the pervasive nature of whiteness and neurotypicality in this research have on the interventions that we develop and that we put into the community. So, I think in the last year, many of us, I know I have become armchair experts at drug development as we've learned more about the COVID-19 vaccines and how they're developed and what this process looks like. So it starts with discovery, where we're identifying promising candidates for drugs, and then these drugs are tested in phase 1 trials, which then identify sort of the maximum tolerable dose that will be safe for people to have. Phase 2 trials, which are therapeutic efficacy trials, then examine the impact of the drug on the biology of the disease or the mechanism. Then in phase 3 trials, we see therapeutic confirmatory trials that evaluate the efficacy of the drug on a clinical endpoint. And then finally, phase 4 trials are therapeutic use trials that essentially do long-term surveillance of outcomes and effectiveness of the drug. There's a model called the orbit model that has been adapted for the basic behavioral and social sciences. So it's moving these drug development phases towards behavioral and social science behavioral intervention development research. And essentially we see here that it follows the same 5 phases as the typical phases of drug development. I think that the key with this model is that we can situate pretty much all studies that will eventually lead to effective community intervention at some point throughout this orbit phase model. The 3 studies that were part of this symposium are all in the phase 2 area. So we have a proof of concept study, we see some feasibility piloting, and then we see some preliminary efficacy research that's happening. So it's all in phase 2. But I think that you can see that these 3 studies look really different in terms of the way that they're testing the intervention and what they're trying to determine and how much they're focusing on efficacy versus on other more preliminary things like feasibility. But it's all phase 2. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about this, but at the end, I'll share with you an opportunity for learning more about clinical trials and behavioral trials that you may be interested in. We're also seeing an increased push towards doing hybrid effectiveness implementation research. So as we've moved away from doing strictly clinical effectiveness research and towards implementation research, we've developed hybrid trials that track relatively closely to the standard phase development of interventions. And even if trials aren't true effectiveness implementation hybrid trials, we do see that at this point, most interventions, and really to do it the right way, you need to include some information in the data that you're collecting about implementation and how that's working and what it's like in practice as part of, at a minimum, feasibility testing and efficacy testing. And I think that we also need to, keep in mind as we're thinking about how we think about implementation before starting a trial, during a trial, and then after a trial is completed. We need to make sure that we're doing this implementation at multiple levels. So the individual level, the provider level, the community level, the health system level, and then the policy level. And all of this matters in terms of how likely an intervention is to actually make a difference in people's lives. And this model is, if you recognize this from some of your social science courses, is adapted from Bronfenbrenner's ecological model of development. I think that we've had a reckoning within the research community in the last year on really addressing the whiteness and neurotypicality of autism research in general, and then autism intervention development more specifically. So in our country, in the US, we have a history of systemic racism. And in science and in autism research specifically, this has led to an underrepresentation of scientists who represent diverse backgrounds and experience and who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. We also see that we've had a really limited inclusion of the perspectives of minoritized groups in autism research. And that also because of systemic racism, we see disparities in identification of autism, in access to services for autistic people, and then in outcomes, both in terms of health and well-being. We also have this history within autism research of othering and pathologizing autistic people and relying on the medical model. And what this leads to is an underrepresentation of autistic sciences in our scientific community. It leads to interventions that don't work in the real world. And then finally, it may lead us to focus on clinical endpoints in trials that aren't particularly meaningful to autistic people or their family members. Now, what can we do about this? So there was a really nice piece that was put out by Desi Jones and David Mandel in 2020 in the journal Autism, where they recommended that as an autism research community, we do 4 things that are at a minimum what we should be doing, but not fully sufficient to tackle this issue of whiteness in autism research. This piece was focused specifically on Black autism researchers, which is something that we should be specifically focusing on. But this also applies to other groups that identify as people of color or who are Indigenous. And what Desi Jones and David Mandel suggested that we do is that we develop Black autism researchers at all career levels, that we create social capital for Black autism researchers and practitioners, and that we identify and address the inequalities and injustices that are disproportionately affecting Black autism researchers and Black autistic people. And then finally, that we listen to Black researchers and to the Black autistic community. And they did a really nice job of giving specific suggestions of what we should be doing. If you haven't read this piece yet, I really recommend that you read it, as this is something that we should all be thinking about in a lot more detail as we are planning studies and conducting them. And also as we're developing our pipelines of autism researchers who are working in our labs, for those of us who are in faculty positions or who hope to be in faculty positions in the future. I want to just end by finally saying that if you want to learn more about clinical trials, it's a 2-week summer camp that is colloquially referred to as Nerd Camp. That is the NIH Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research Summer Institute on Randomized Behavioral Clinical Trials. If you go to this, you'll learn about the state of the art of behavioral clinical trials and how to do them, and you'll get a lot of help planning a really elegantly conducted clinical trial for your research. I'm looking forward to talking about all of these papers and then also some of these discussion topics in more detail during the Q&A today. Thanks.